When it comes to the all-time greatest moments from the Lord of the Rings books that never made it into the movie, Pippin's first day at Minas Tirith would almost be at the top of that list. His adventures through the White City without Gandalf by his side introduce us to key characters, plot points, and crazy details that Peter Jackson decided just couldn't make the cut for the film adaptation. If you've read the books, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you're probably shedding a tear for Baragond right now. But if it's been a while since you've skimmed Tolkien's original works, or if you've only ever watched the movies, then this video is perfect for you, as today I'm going to be revealing over a dozen crucial details that the movie removed, changed, or simply got wrong in the film adaptation of one of the most important moments in The Return of the King, which is Gandalf and Pippin's arrival at Minas Tirith. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 36 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I take the greatest film trilogy of all time and compare it to the original books that inspired it, scene by scene, page by page. This way we can all relive the lore together and find out how accurate this adaptation really was to Tolkien's original books. Today we have a lot to cover, as we aren't only uncovering every change made to Pippin's time at Minas Tirith, but through these changes we'll be revealing the true character of Denethor, who ultimately got the short end of the stick just like the rest of his family in these movies. Of course, we'll cover Denethor more in future scenes, especially when he goes crazy, but his initial introduction in this chapter of the book that we're covering today is very different from the movie. Before we go any further, however, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. As always, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happens during this scene of the movie. Picking up with where we left off last week, we see Pippin and Gandalf galloping on Shadowfax toward Minas Tirith. After a montage of them traveling, we see them arrive at the White City and head up to the top level where the Great Hall is located. Before entering, Pippin sees the White Tree of Gondor, and Gandalf gives him instructions to not share any information with Denethor. Then the duo walks into the throne room and sees a man sitting on a seat below the main throne. Gandalf and Pippin approach him, and they speak with Denethor, who is holding his son Boromir's broken horn. Seeing this, Pippin takes it upon himself to offer himself as payment for Boromir's actions, but Gandalf tells him to get up and then tries to reason with the steward. Denethor is not willing to listen, however, and Gandalf takes Pippin with him as he leaves the foolish man in his grief. Gandalf gives Pippin a little bit of a breakdown of the lore of Gondor, and then we cut to Sam and Frodo, but we're skipping that for this episode as we'll cover Frodo's scenes next week. After the brief Sam and Frodo moment, the scene returns to Pippin and Gandalf in their room at Minas Tirith, and Pippin is looking over his newly acquired sword and uniform, which is part of his new position in Gondor. Gandalf tells him that he is in the service of the steward now, and he will have to do as he's told. And then he and Pippin talk about the coming battle and the calm before the storm. As they look out over the land, they see a bright green light flash up into the sky, and Gandalf tells Pippin about Sauron's most loyal and darkest servant, the Witch King of Angmar. Plus, Gandalf says that there are men from other places in Middle-earth who are servants of Sauron and coming to aid him in his battle against Gondor. And on those lighthearted notes, which definitely won't give Pippin nightmares, our scene ends for this week. So now let's jump right into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. As for characters, we have some of the worst omissions so far in this series. Specifically, there's one character who I personally am very sad never made it into the movie, and that is Baragond. Baragond plays a role later on as well, and is almost single-handedly the reason that Faramir survives Denethor. But as for his involvement today, he simply is Pippin's closest friend in Minas Tirith. But more on that later. Besides Baragond, we're missing his son Burgil, Ingold, and some other guards at the Wall of the Pelennor, and a whole host of people who come in from different parts of Gondor to aid them in their battle. This includes people like Forlong the Fat and Prince Imrahil. Plus, throughout some of the lore and history we get from Tolkien or Gandalf, there are many names that aren't addressed in the films. But I won't bother going through all of them now, or else we'd be here all day. Now for timeline, we have a few deviations. First, although the movie shows Gandalf and Pippin riding to Minas Tirith, the book shares the details of their multi-day journey, and they even stop at Edoras at one point. We'll touch on this in the plot changes, but the main timeline difference is just the fact that the travel is skimmed over in the movie. I get it though, they couldn't show every little thing, but hey, it's my job to point out all the changes. The second timeline change is simply the fact that they skipped over Pippin's entire day in Minas Tirith and went straight from their meeting with Denethor to nighttime in their room. And lastly, the overall timeline of these scenes isn't completely accurate because Frodo, Sam, and Gollum were not at Cirith Ungol right when Gandalf and Pippin would have been looking out over the land. The movie lines these timelines up as it switches back and forth from the perspectives of Pippin and Gandalf, and then Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, even showing them both seeing the green flash of light into the sky at the same time as the Witch King releases his army. But according to the book's timeline, Frodo and Sam would have just been getting to the Morgul Road and didn't reach Minas Morgul until the following day. Finally, before getting to our plot changes, we have location, which is pretty simple this week. Because of Gandalf and Pippin's travel being condensed, they remove their stop at the walls of Ramas Ekor on the border of the Pelennor Fields. This is where Ingold and some other Gondorian guards are at work, and they speak with Gandalf before letting him pass through to the city. But we'll be unpacking this more in just a minute, as it's one of the first plot changes we have to cover. Of course, before we do though, I just want to remind you that I can't go word for word through Tolkien's text and correct every line change or word spoken, or else we'd be here for hours. So I'd highly recommend checking out the audiobooks if you want to relive this series all over again for yourself or for the first time. You can claim your free trial of Audible using my link in the description, which gets you one free audiobook of your choice and supports the channel at the same time. Now that being said, let's get into the plot changes. To start things off, we've got a few changes right from the time of Gandalf and Pippin traveling. Although these moments do make it onto the screen as a few cuts of Shadowfax galloping through different terrains, Tolkien goes into the details of their journey. So here's a few things that we miss in the movie that are in the book version. First, we learn from Pippin that it was a 4-day journey since the incident with the Palantir. Second, along that 4-day ride, they had stopped at one point to rest and bring news to Edoras. This is where Gandalf informed the Rohirrim that were guarding the city to pick up and move along to Dunharrow, where the king would meet them. Pippin also notes that a winged terror had passed overhead soon after they arrived, but he doesn't remember the details of the event because Gandalf spoke soft words to him and he fell asleep. I'm guessing that Gandalf put some sort of spell on him to get him to be quiet and not cause any trouble during their travels. But anyway, after Gandalf finished up his business at Edoras, he and Pippin set off once again. And that brings us to our third and final detail of this journey, which was left out of the movie, and probably the largest one of them all, and that is the fact that Pippin notices fire on the mountains as they travel, and Gandalf explains that they are the beacons of Gondor. That's right, the beacons of Gondor are lit before Gandalf and Pippin ever even get to Minas Tirith. So essentially, the entire plot point of Pippin lighting the first beacon in the movie is completely made up. We'll cover that again in a future episode once we get to that scene, but it's unavoidable to mention now since it happens almost at the beginning of this chapter. Now, before we get into their time with Denethor and then Pippin's activities in the city, there's one final omission from the book, which is their stop at the wall of the Pelennor, aka Ramas Ekor. This 30-mile-long wall ran the perimeter of the Pelennor Fields and came up against the Mindalluin Mountain on both the southern and northern side of Minas Tirith. This wall is entirely removed from the movie, but it was the main defense of the city after the Anduin itself, and during the battle it was breached in multiple places. At the time Gandalf and Pippin came to it, it was under repair by Ingold and his men, and Gandalf encouraged them to give up their work and prepare for battle as war was upon them. But before letting Gandalf go through, Ingold asked who his companion was, saying that although Gandalf was allowed through to the city, they did not know what Pippin was. Gandalf then vouched for Pippin by saying that he has passed through more battles in peril than Ingold himself. But after being called a man, Pippin, who Gandalf thought was asleep, roused and corrected them, saying that he is not a man but a hobbit. They then continue talking, and Pippin eventually reveals that Boromir is dead, to which Gandalf quickly tells him to shut up and that he shouldn't have revealed that information. But Ingold says that they're already aware of this, and the Lord Denethor will be eager to hear more news of his son, and at that they let Gandalf and Pippin through. Once through, Tolkien uses this time to fill us in on a lot of the lore about Gondor and the surrounding areas. Specifically, in typical Tolkien fashion, we learn about the geography of the land as Pippin looks around himself while they ride toward the city. Once they get to the city, they once again have to pass some guards. However, this interaction is much more brief. We simply read that the men were shouting Mithrandir, Mithrandir, as the people were all well aware of who Gandalf was. But he yelled at them to let him pass, and he and Pippin rode onward until they reached the top level where Denethor was seated. And now that brings us to the next section of this chapter, which is their conversation with the Steward of Gondor. Throughout this interaction, there are multiple changes. Although it is evident that Peter Jackson and his writers pulled lines and moments from the chapter, there are a lot of things that got omitted or details that were changed around to fit Jackson's altered timeline. Like I said before, I can't go word for word, but I'll do my best to highlight the important details you should know about from this moment in the book, and how it differs from the adaptation. To start, there's the crucial detail of Denethor's wisdom and knowledge prior to Gandalf's arrival. You see, in the movie, he is soaked in a sorrow and seems blind to everything else. but Tolkien makes it very clear that in the book he's still in control of his wits at this point, and he is a very wise and discerning man. Although he isn't king, the stewards of Gondor possess farsight and knowledge about the happenings in Middle-earth. And one of those things that he's aware of that the movie skips over is the fact that Gandalf brings someone with him who witnessed Boromir die. This is one of the first things Denethor says when the duo approaches the seat, and Gandalf confirms that this is one of the halflings who was there, and that the other is with Theoden of Rohan. But he also adds that neither halfling is the one that the omen spoke of. Remember, Denethor would be familiar with the omen that both of his sons heard before Boromir set out to Rivendell, and the very last part of that omen mentioned a halfling. So Denethor would have mulled over this poem and been very familiar with it. And speaking of Boromir setting out, by the way, Denethor mentions that he has little love for halflings since that omen took his son from him, and then he adds that Faramir should have gone in his stead. Gandalf wisely replies that Faramir would have gone, but Boromir would not let anyone else but himself go on the errand. Denethor then talks some more and shows him the horn, and then just like in the movie, Pippin steps forward and gives some details of Boromir's death and then pledges himself to the steward. But this is where we have our next change, and that is that Gandalf actually supports this action on Pippin's part. In the movie, he whacks him with his staff and tries to reason with Denethor, but in the book, Pippin actually pledges himself right then and there. He takes out his sword and presents it to the steward, who recognizes the blade and asks where it came from. Pippin then explains that it came from the Barrow Downs outside of the Shire, and then they continue on with this small ceremony which inducts Pippin into the service of the Steward of Gondor. The whole time, Gandalf lets it happen, and even gives a little instruction to Pippin on what to do since the Hobbit has no idea what all of this entails. The movie saves this ceremony for a later scene, and they also move something else to a later scene, which is Denethor's meal. That's right, the iconic meal scene from the movie actually takes place right now, for an hour. Yep, right after Pippin gets sworn into service, Denethor's first order is for the halfling to share his full tale, everything from start to finish. Of course, Pippin has been instructed by Gandalf earlier on what information to withhold, but he shares everything he can for an hour while Denethor eats. There's also a moment before this when Denethor tells the servants to bring chairs and food, and Gandalf finally gets a little annoyed at the fact that Denethor seems so nonchalant about things. However, Denethor has a stare-off with the wizard, and Pippin notes that Denethor seems like a great wizard as well. But after a brief staring contest, Denethor was the first to look away. It is then after this that Pippin shares his tale, and Tolkien writes that Pippin never forgot that hour in the Great Hall being interrogated by the steward. Which brings us to the next change, as after Pippin wrapped up his full tale, Denethor finished up his meal and then gave instructions for Gandalf and Pippin to be taken to their lodgings. Although he adds that Pippin will soon be taken elsewhere since he's been sworn into the service of the guard. We'll get to that part in a moment when Pippin goes out on the town, but obviously you can see here that Gandalf's exit is much different. In the movie, Denethor is erratic and says he won't bow to some ranger from the north, and then Gandalf storms out. But in the book version, Denethor has seen to their lodgings and even gives instructions for the captains of the guard to meet him later. The closest parallel we get to this part of their conversation in the book is that Gandalf remarks how he knows what Denethor was doing when he questioned Pippin for an hour. Obviously, he was trying to get information out of the Hobbit and learn of Aragorn. And he did. Although Pippin did his best, he still revealed some information about a ranger from the north. Denethor then makes some passive-aggressive type remarks saying that the rule of Gondor is his and his alone unless the king returns. And that is the next biggest change. I know I don't go line by line, but this one is important, as the movie doesn't include that last part of unless the king returns. In fact, in the movie, he even acknowledges Aragorn's heritage, but insinuates it isn't worthy of taking the throne anymore. Although it's possible that Book Denethor shares this sentiment, he's wise enough in the book to not say it out loud, as it would have been a massive breach of honor and loyalty to deny the return of the king. Gandalf then has a few more words for Denethor, pretty much saying that he is a steward as well, but a steward over the entirety of Middle-earth. And then he turned and left, taking Pippin with him. Our next change is the small detail that after Gandalf and Pippin left, they spoke for a bit, with Pippin worried that he upset Gandalf, but Gandalf just laughed and replied that Pippin did as well as he could. He adds that he didn't stop Pippin from pledging himself to the steward because it was a generous deed and one should not hinder those. Then Gandalf told Pippin that he's going to go gather news, and he assigned Pippin the task of finding where Shadowfax was being housed and make sure that they're taking good care of him. A small detail that Tolkien adds is that the people of Gondor rarely saw horses, and so they might not know how to properly take care of such a great steed as Shadowfax. Then, after this instruction, the two companions split up and Pippin was left on his own. And this is where we get to the rest of the chapter, which essentially is completely removed from the movie, as the film skips to nighttime when Gandalf and Pippin are in their room. which means that our next change is the omission of Pippin's entire day at the city. Obviously, I can't go into every single detail or else I'd just be reading straight from the book, but I do want to highlight a few key moments and specifically talk about Baragond. So, picking back up from when Gandalf and Pippin split up, we continue the narrative, which is written from Pippin's point of view, as he went out to find Shadowfax. As he walked out, he realized that he was starving, since he was only given a little wine and a little bread during his hour with Denethor. He then saw a man walk in his direction and decided to speak to the man as he was feeling lonely and hungry. But to his surprise, the man came straight towards him. The man of Gondor then introduced himself to Pippin as Baragond, and said that he was instructed to come find him and show him around. They then speak for a moment, and Pippin asks where they can get a bite to eat. And then he remembered Shadowfax and informed Baragond that they needed to go and look for the horse first. So the two set off to the stables where Shadowfax was being kept, and Pippin ensured that his manger was full and that he was updated on Gandalf's whereabouts. Then, leaving Shadowfax, Baragond and Pippin set out to get their own food. And this is where we have the largest portion of Pippin and Baragond's interaction, as they gathered food from the storehouse and then took it up to a great outthrust battlement which gave them a good view out over the land. They ate and spoke as the sun rose, and Pippin told Baragond all about his land and his tales, and Baragond grew more and more amazed by the second. We then learn that Baragond has a son of his own who has stayed in the city as all the other women and children have left. They also discuss the 9 riders for a bit, and Baragond shares some history of Osgiliath. This whole moment of Pippin and Baragond talking while looking out over the land takes quite a few pages and is obviously a parallel to what we see in the movie of Gandalf and Pippin in their room. In fact, Baragond is the one who says it is but the deep breath before the plunge. Plus, although there is no moment of Minas Morgul exploding with green light and an army coming forth, there is a brief shadow that passes across the sun, and they hear the faint cry of a fell rider. Finally, after a lot of talking, the noon bells rang and Baragond invited Pippin to go back with him to lunch with his company. Pippin, still being hungry, did just that and was greeted with great honor amongst the men, as a rumor had spread that he was a halfling prince and that 5,000 halflings would be coming out of the north to help them in the battle. Then, after their lunch, Baragond rose and said farewell to Pippin as he had duties until sundown. But he instructed Pippin to go find his son Burgle if he wanted some company, and Pippin does just that. Then we have sort of part 2 of Pippin's day as he goes off and hangs out with Burgle and the other boys who stayed back in the city with their fathers. They go to the front gates and watch as reinforcements arrive in the city. Many different groups of people are listed off with the number of men who came to fight, and the final group to come into the city was led by Prince Imrahil and his 700 men from Dol Amroth. He'll come up again in the future, but for now the chapter wraps up on a dark note as the city is disappointed in how few men came to their aid. Only a couple thousand in total. The chapter officially ends after Pippin parts company from Burgle and goes to rejoin Baragond and his company again for dinner. Then he heads off to bed and sleeps until the next morning when he's summoned by Lord Denethor for his official duties. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, as we won't get into Pippin's second day in Minas Tirith until a future scene in the movie. For now, that wraps up all of the changes, omissions, and alterations for this week. This chapter is actually the first in the Return of the King book and sets things up for the rest of the story. And I'd highly encourage you to go back and read it again for yourself if it's been a while. Although I covered as much as I could here, I think this is such a good part of the story as Pippin makes some friends and some key characters are introduced. Baragond and Prince Imrahil will come up again later, and like I said earlier in the video, Baragond is essential to the survival of his captain, Faramir. So it's a shame that he didn't make it into the movie. But enough of what I think. What do you think about the changes for this week? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.